right, we are here with Senator Gustavo Rivera, who is from the 33rd District in New York. We're going to talk about
in
the
the
IDC.
Bronx.
In the Bronx.
You have to be more specific.
The Bronx. Say it the right way.
The third. I am the state senator for the 33rd District from the Boogie Down Bronx. With our X's. We have to throw our X's out.
Okay, so I have been covering the IDC, as you know, and I figured, why not come to the Capitol and talk to real-life Democratic senators who have to deal with this independent Democratic conference. Gustavo, you've been here for, this is your 7th year.
Correct.
And you've seen the formation of the IDC from start to today. What is the IDC? Where did it come from?
Well, first of all, it happened, I was elected in 2010, and when I started serving in 2011, I was sworn in then, and that is when the IDC came to be. It wasn't my fault. I just want to make that clear. But the IDC came to be, at least the reasoning that was given then, was 4 Democratic senators broke away saying that the mainland Democratic Conference was corrupt, was broken, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so 4 of them broke away and formed their own independent conference that has been in existence until today. And the issue is, there were a lot of issues you could mention at that point that might be a reason to potentially, go and form your own little crew. But the reality is that, first of all, we are not the same conference that we were back then. Number 2, when you look at the reality of the folks that left, in particular, who leads the IDC, at that point he was both the deputy leader of the Senate Democratic Conference, as well as the chair of the DSCC, which is the Democratic Senatorial Campaign Committee, the political arm of the Democratic Conference. So in both of those instances, he was one of the folks that was leading the Democratic Conference, but then all of a sudden there was...
This is Jeff Klein.
This is Jeff Klein, yes. He was leading he was one of the people that was leading the Democratic Conference at that point, also leading the political efforts of the conference. And then when things didn't necessarily work out in 2010, then he broke away and formed his own conference, and more specifically in 2012, which is really when everything comes together. And in 2012, the Democratic Conference won enough seats to be in the majority in a body of 63 people. We had 32 members, or 32 people that had D's next to their name. And in that moment, they decided that they would caucus with the Republicans, and therefore gave a majority to the Republican conference when we had more Democrats than Republicans at that moment.
Now, they fight back and they say that they're not caucusing with Republicans. They have their own caucus. But of course, the other side says you're voting on issues with Republicans regularly. But they like to say that they're progressive. And, they just decided to join their own conference, which I still don't have an answer as to why publicly they would create their own conference and be progressive when they could just be progressive with the Democrats. Have you seen a change in their messaging over the past few years as they've grown?
I've certainly seen a change in the main message that they've always communicated is that they get things done, and that they are progressives who get things done. I don't think that that's accurate when you look at what has actually occurred. When you think about, there's a couple of instances that I think particularly speak to this. Even though we were successful last year in finally raising the minimum wage to 15, that was a direct result, not of the legislative battles that were fought here. That was really part of it. That was a small part of it. The big part of it was what happened across the nation when there was such a huge push to make sure that we just talking about the basic idea of getting $15 an hour. 2012, when we were talking about raising the minimum wage then, because it was $7.50 in the state of New York,
right.
The Democratic Conference, which I belong to, we were saying we need to go up to $9 immediately. We need to peg it to inflation, so we don't have to come back and do this battle again. We have to include tipped workers. All of these things we were talking about. The deal that was ultimately cut by the IDC, and which they claimed credit for and said that they had a victory, was that it would go up to $9 an hour over 3 years. Second, it would not be pegged to inflation, so we would have to come back and fight the battle again like we did last year. Did not include tipped workers, and at that point even included a part that gave, if you were an employer and employed people that were under 18, at minimum wage, you actually got a tax credit. So it was this weird this weird thing that was injected in there that was purely a Republican concoction. That's what the IDC was able to produce. So when you think about progressive causes, when you think about progressive action, and when you think about progressive legislation, you look at the results of what they've been able to achieve, and you've been able to get watered down versions of things, that being the most clear example. And I don't think that really speaks to what we need to have, not only in the state, but across the country.
For the past few years, since the IDC has been formed, the public hasn't really been paying much attention. It seems like they've been able to fly under the radar, get away with these things, go back to their districts, say they're progressive, pass legislation with fancy names, progressive-sounding names, and that's worked. But now, flash forward to 2017, and their conference has grown, but they're also facing, a lot of these members are facing protesters in their districts. People seem to be paying attention, seem to be woke. Mm-hmm. Do you think that that's pressuring these IDC members right now to, number one, break away, go back to the Democrats, or actually produce real progressive legislation?
As I always tell folks, people that don't like to be responsive to their constituency rely on people, on their constituency not really knowing what's going on. And if there's one thing one silver lining, if you will, in this era that I call the orange madness that we find ourselves in right now.
Trump.
Yes, I will not mention his name, but orange madness, orange plague, whatever you want to call it. Bottom line is that people are paying attention, and people are asking themselves real questions about who represents them and what they actually stand for. And so do I think that so the people that are showing up at these offices, that are showing up at these town hall meetings, that they're accusing us of, organizing to do this, these folks are organizing themselves.
The IDC is accusing the Democrats of organizing protests.
Correct. The IDC is accusing us, the Democratic Conference, of being the ones that are responsible for putting these town halls together. That is not accurate. And you can just go into any of these town halls and ask the individuals who were there. These are constituents from these districts that feel, wait a minute, we're supposed to have a Democratic representative. Why all of a sudden are you helping the Republicans out? Which is what's happening here. Ultimately, when you look at the numbers, just based on the numbers, we should be in the majority. And this is, so when we're talking about any issues that you can mention, whether we're talking about education, healthcare, taxation, criminal justice, environmental justice, all of these things, we could actually move the ball forward in a real way in New York, and we can't, because these folks have been playing footsie with the Republicans for going on 6 years now.
Why do they do it? Why do these people join the conference? Why do the IDC members even join the conference? What's the point of even being there?
I think that if you'd have to ask them to see what their reasoning is. They argue, what they argue publicly is, well, we get things done. If you look at the things that they've been able to get done are half measures at best, watered down versions of things that we all care about. And when I say we, I mean not only the Democratic Conference, but progressives generally. They haven't been able to achieve real victories in these. So why do they do it? Listen, if you get chairmanship, you get a larger office, you get more office staff, you get to put your bills on the floor of the Senate, as long as they're not real things. You get to do all those things, which is, I'm glad for them. Mm-hmm. But the fact is that the majority of Democrats, that the majority of people in the state are represented by Democrats. That is just numerically accurate. The majority of people in the state. And most importantly, the majority of people of color in the state and the majority of poor folks in the state and working class people in the state are represented by Democrats. These are the folks that are not getting that benefit. And I also, one of the things that I mentioned consistently, particularly about that period between 2012 and 2014, when the IDC straight up gave power to the Republicans, you had many of us, so you could have mentioned my colleague Liz Kruger could have been the chair of finance. My colleague Adriano Espaillat, who's now in Congress, could have been the chair of housing. Myself, I could have been the chair of the health committee. Now, in the case of the health committee, for example, there's never been a Latino, person of color, period, and certainly not someone from the Bronx, that is the unhealthiest county in the entire state of New York, that's ever been the chair of that committee. I think it would make a difference in the conversations about policy if you had folks that had those types of constituencies and these types of interests that were sitting at the table actually making policy. So that's what the IDC has stopped, unfortunately.
So the Republicans are essentially giving them committee chair positions as well, even though they're not officially caucusing with Republicans?
Mm-hmm. They're all chairs of committees. That makes a difference not only in you can determine what goes on the agenda of that particular committee, but you also get something that is colloquially known as a Lulu, and that is an extra amount of money that you get on top of your salary, which, you know, I mean, as ranking members, we get it as well. I'm the ranking member in the health committee, so that's like vice president, if you will, of the health committee. And I know that certainly means that I have to do more work for it, and I do, because I don't have any outside income. I just do this for a living. But that is one of the perks that you get, if you will, that you are a chair of a committee, so you get to determine what gets on the agenda, and also that you get extra staff by being a chairman or a chairperson.
Albany is known for being plagued by corruption, and
why would you say that?
How many lawmakers have gone to jail, been indicted? You know, it's a record number in the past, 30 years. But in the past couple of years, the leaders of the Senate and the Assembly have actually been indicted and convicted. How has the culture changed since they've been gone? As
a parenthesis, my three predecessors, have all gone to prison for violating the public trust, including my immediate predecessor, a guy by the name of Pedro Espada, who's currently in federal prison for stealing public money. But that is closed parenthesis. As far as how it's changed, I think that there's many of us that came here very specifically fighting against that. I know that my candidacy back in 2010 was based around the fact that this person who's now again in federal prison had just violated the public trust for a very long time, and the people in his district, in my district, were not being well represented. So I came up here very clearly saying, that is one of the reasons I'm coming up here. I want to make sure that I serve my constituency right, that I establish, change not only the culture but also the laws so that we can have real ethics reform. And unfortunately, that hasn't really moved.
Yeah. Why has ethics reform not been passed?
That's a good question. We, in the Democratic Conference, we have, since I got here in 2011, we have consistently talked about things that need to change, about full disclosure of outside income, as far as campaign finance reform, and we have been, as a conference, we've always been pushing for that every single year. I have been a sponsor of many of these pieces of legislation. I have fought about them on the floor of the Senate and in the public eye like this. You have to think about who's actually in power, because if the majority leader doesn't allow for something to move to the floor, or the chair of the finance committee doesn't allow for something to move forward in the finance committee, then it's not going to go anywhere.
So if the Democrats were in control, would ethics reform be passed?
Absolutely. Because we would be, first of all, we would be talking about it immediately, and we would be able to move it from a committee to the floor. We would be able to talk about it, and we put everybody on the record, because that's the other thing. It's real easy to be for something when you don't have to vote for it. We think a couple years ago, before we passed marriage equality in the state of New York, there was a very historic vote on marriage equality that didn't pass. It failed by one vote. But it was an incredible opportunity to put everybody on the record saying, if you believe in this, or if you don't believe in it, you have to be in the public eye saying why you take the stand that you do. So I believe that on issues of ethics reform, on issues of campaign finance reform, on issues of closing the LLC loophole, of creating a public financing system in the state of New York, both of which are huge causes that I not only believe in, but I think would change the way that we do work around here. We would be able to talk about them immediately. We would put them up on the floor, and we would put everybody on the record saying, what do you believe about campaign finance reform? Do you think that we should close the LLC loophole, which is the legal limited liability corporations right now can give the same amount of money that an individual can give, and if you own 5 LLCs, you can give me your check, your personal check, plus one for each one of your LLCs, which is obscene. And when the amount of money that you can give me, so if you want to, if I was running for president, you would be only able to give me like $2,700
Individually, yeah.
individually. As a senator, I can get about $9,000 in the primary cycle and about $6,000, $6,000 in the primary cycle and $9,000 in the general cycle. So you can give me something like 15 grand individually. And if you had an LLC, you could give me one check for each one of those, for the primary and for the general. So that is something that we think we should change, and we have been talking about it the entire time that I have been here. And it hasn't happened because we have not been in the majority to be able to push it out there.
How, yeah, the governor is the de facto leader of the Democratic Party in New York State. He's not known to be someone who sits back and lets others take control. He goes out there and he expresses how he feels about things, and he's a strong personality. That's probably the best way of saying it.
Certainly is.
Why is the governor not doing anything about this? These group of now 8 Democrats caucusing, or caucusing on their own, but voting with Republicans.
And that's again a question you're going to have to ask the governor. But I think that we have to look at what people's actions are and judge them based on what their actions are. And I certainly am thankful for the governor for getting certain things done in the state. Marriage equality got done partly thanks to his leadership, and there's things that have happened all over the state which have been positive. But it is in the era of the orange madness, we have to ask real questions here, and there has to be. I think that there needs to be a unity here. We need to be, as Democrats, we need to be focused on one thing, and that is serving our constituency to the best of our ability. And again, in the era of orange madness, defend ourselves in the state of New York from the things that are going to come down from the federal government. Now, we are all clear on that, it seems. I think that we need to measure our people's actions. I mean, what are we going to do, all as Democrats, to figure out how we can get under the same tent to defend the interests of our constituency and of vulnerable populations that are going to be attacked by what's happening in Washington.
So how do you deal with your colleagues in the Senate when they're throwing out attacks literally on the floor of the Senate against you, your colleagues, your Democratic colleagues? How do you, it's not just the culture, but like how do you work together on anything if there's just so much animosity right now between the conferences?
I think we should focus on the work. That's ultimately what it comes down to. Like, there's always going to be certain people that don't like certain people. The goal here has to be, what can we move beyond that? I believe we have to. Mm-hmm. It's not whether we can or whether we should, but we have to. If you have the attacks that are coming from the national government, whether it's on issues of immigration, whether it's on issues of choice, whether it's on issues of education, whether it's on issues of criminal justice, whether it's on issues of environmental justice, we can be a bulwark against that in the state, but only if we do it as a unified front. Mm-hmm. So I just focus on the work. And and I'm not going to say I'm certainly not perfect. I might get, and some of my colleagues will tell you that sometimes I'm a little passionate. But I think that I have to, what I focus on is the fact that the median income in my district is $27,000 a year. What I focus on is that I have over 60% of the people in my district are Latinos, with a large population of undocumented people that live in my district. What I focus on is on poor and working class women who don't have health insurance. Mm-hmm. And we're able to get it with the Affordable Care Act. Like, these are the folks that I care about. And I think that if you're truly focused on the work that you have to do, and this is what I'm happy that people are going to these town halls and people are going to these district offices, because I would tell folks when I go do civics classes in my district, and I always tell my constituents, never assume that when you're talking to an elected official, you're talking to a person that's a good human being. Mm-hmm. He or she can be. They can be wonderful people, but never assume that. Ultimately, we are public servants. And we have to, and when people have to demand things from us, then they should. So if you're going to focus on who you're serving, if you're going to focus on your constituency, then you can put kind of the personal stuff to the side, either because you care about the bigger picture, or because you realize that if you don't care about the bigger picture, then you might get unelected. Mm-hmm. So I think that ultimately we just have to focus on the work and remember that if we're going to be true Democrats and we're going to be a bulwark against what's happening in Washington, D.C., which is all too real. This is no longer a fantasy that it was like, well, this might happen. They might try to take away, they might try to keep Muslims from entering the country. That might happen. It's happening. They're trying to do it. We might block grant Medicaid. No, it's happening. The current Secretary of the Department of Health is saying that's the Health and Human Services said that that's what he wants to do. These are not insignificant things that are going to have immense impact on the constituencies that we're supposed to care about. So if you really care about them, show that you do with policy and with action.
In the states.
That's correct. And that's what we have to do in the state of New York.
When you get to the root of who's behind this group, this gang of 8 plus 1, the other member, a Democrat who is actually in the conference with Republicans. It's my job as an investigative reporter to follow the money, and it would be irresponsible not to figure out who's controlling their pocketbooks. It's not cheap to run for office.
No, it is not.
And some of these folks are newly elected, and they've immediately joined the IDC despite having run as Democrats. What sort of resources do you think are flowing? I mean, there was a report, this week about the Independence Party, which is another line in New York, that is possibly funding the IDC. What do you know as a Democrat?
Well, as far as the Independence Party, what's happening there is that in the state of New York, you have candidate committees, right? So I have a committee that I use for my campaign, but the Democratic Party, the political parties can have a separate committee, which can actually move money in different ways. They're called housekeeping committees, and political parties are the only ones that can have them. So the IDC is not a political party that's separate from the Democrats. And so one of the things that they did, when you think about it, it's quite brilliant. They got the Independence Party, which is an existing line in the state of New York, to give them the ability to use the capacity for their campaign committee that is a party committee that can receive much more money and give a lot more money. They gave them the ability to use it as their campaign committee. And so if you go and look at who's giving that money, I mean, you'll see what we're talking about, and you'll also get to see why it's necessary that we change the campaign finance rules in the state. There's in the state of New York, there's a lot of money that moves around from developers, a lot of money that moves around from real estate, a lot. In comparison to labor, for example, labor is insignificant compared to how much money developers and real estate move. There's also all sorts of other big corporate interests, but I would say that those are two of the biggest ones. And it's one of the most egregious examples when you have an individual can have 5 properties, let's say, like I said earlier, has 5 buildings that he or she owns. There's usually a limited liability corporation for each one of those buildings as a way to protect the business, right? If one building, goes under, what have you, the other ones don't get impacted as much. So again, when you have 5 properties in the state of New York, you have individuals that are huge property owners that have 15, 20, 30, 50, 100 properties and an LLC for each one. You can move hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars. Matter of fact, there was an independent study done a few years ago by an organization called the Hedge Clippers, which identified one individual in particular, a guy by the name of Leonard Litwin, as an individual within a 2-year period or 3-year period, moving somewhere in the neighborhood of $11 million as one individual to a bunch of different parties and individuals, etc. So if you look at what the campaign committees are, you'll see a lot of that money, and you'll also see the need for having real campaign finance reform in the state of New York.
How about charter schools?
There's some money. I don't know how much money we're talking about in charter schools, but because charter schools are usually, there's some groups that are funded by hedge fund managers and other folks in finance, and that's obviously another heavy hand in the state of New York. You will certainly see a lot of money in that regard.
Final thoughts on what everyday New Yorkers can do, how they can respond to the IDC, what they can learn about the IDC?
The first thing they need to do is they need to figure out who their representatives are. In the state, there are, if you are in the state of New York, you have an assembly member and a state senator, because we're a bicameral legislature. We have 150 assembly members, that is controlled by the Democratic Party, and 63 senators, and that's the complicated situation that we've been talking about today. They should first find out who their representative is. There's 8 members of the IDC, and they should, if you're a constituent of one of these folks, communicate with them. There are things that you care about, whether it is, and I've said a lot of these things already, but whether you care about education, whether you care about health care, whether you care about choice, whether you care about environmental justice, or criminal justice, etc. Figure out what the positions of these particular individuals are. Call them, interact with them, and go online to find other like-minded folks that are doing the same thing. And that is organically happening now, and I think it needs to continue to happen, because as somebody used to say to me, there's 2 ways you can go about this. You either, when somebody's not on the right, you either show them the light or you turn up the heat. Mm-hmm. Those are the only 2 things that you can do. And in this case, what you have is that some of my colleagues in the Senate, who are members of the IDC, are getting the heat turned up on them, as well as they should. The fact is that the conference that I belong to, the Democratic Conference, we have been pushing forward on issues of criminal justice reform, on ethics, campaign finance reform, for the entire time that I've been here. And we will continue to do that because we believe it is the right thing to do, and we believe we need to defend our constituencies. So the folks out there that have IDC members, we got to ask them to do that. And hopefully we will get to a point where we recognize, all of us, that our responsibility is first to our constituency and not to ourselves.
Thank you, Senator Rivera.
Absolutely, man.